sun will still rise, the next day. And the Lord is still loving us, whether or not I finish these sessions.
What's the title?
The title for these next 2 sessions, we're going to look at the problem of suffering and evil and injustice and the existence of God and why he allows this and so forth. There's a number of different facets to that. So I want to start with part 1 here. Part 1 is why evil and injustice actually point to God rather than can be used as an argument against God's existence. It can be used as a reason to be angry with God, I'll grant that. To be disappointed with God, I'll grant that. But it cannot be used effectively, and by effectively I mean if you start diving into it, as an argument against the existence of God. And the main idea here, it makes no sense at all to talk about evil and injustice in this world unless there's some ultimate standard of perfection and beauty that's being violated. If there's no standard of perfection and beauty that's being violated, then really this is an imaginary concept. In fact, one of the philosophers I read in my graduate studies, David Gautier, said that morality is an appendage of outworn religious beliefs. And he properly recognized that if there is, he didn't believe in God, he's an atheist, and as an atheist, morality is actually, a throwback of superstition. Now, I have talked with a lot of people who actually believe that, and they're scary people indeed, because the only thing that keeps them from slipping a knife into your kidney is the unfortunate concept. They're practical. They're practical about it. I don't want to go to jail, don't want to do this. But here's this. So let's dive into this a little deeper. So let's imagine you're in charge of about 15 children. And it's time for the children to go outside and play. And you say to the children now, I really want to respect. It's important that we respect each person's viewpoints here. I want you to remember that as you go outside. So you're going to play a game. But each person needs to respect. You need to make up your own rules. You need to have your own truth about the game that we're going to play. So each person makes up your rule, and everybody's you're to respect the idea that each of us has a different view on what the rules are. Okay, have fun. Recess ends in 20 minutes. So you send them out to play. What kind of a game do you think that would be? 15 children, each making up their own rules, and occasionally you hear the cry, cheating, like the word, would you laugh when you heard somebody, he was cheating? That would be almost funny. But what do you mean cheating? There are no generally agreed upon rules in this game. It's everybody makes up their own, and that's good. And we need to respect that because everybody has their own truth when it comes to playing the game. Now, you may think that's a little absurd and ridiculous, but that's precisely where we are today in our moral state of affairs in our culture. But the idea here is that we cannot complain about cheating in a game unless there are some overarching rules that are being violated, and in the same way, just as we cannot do that, in the same way we cannot meaningfully talk about good and evil and injustice unless there is a standard of perfection and beauty that's being violated. So the next question is, what is that standard? Okay, so we would probably have to generally agree there's something is being violated when we're talking about injustice. And everyone I've ever talked to, atheist, theist, agnostic, whatever, always believes there's some standard being violated. The question is what? What is that standard? So let's move on. Look at some options here. Could this standard of perfection be a personal choice? Be your truth? Well, okay, my truth works as long as I don't have to interact with other people, but when we start interacting with other people to have a society and a culture and get along together, my personal truth then, there needs to be a higher truth out there. And the other thing is that when you say certain people behave better or are more just than other certain people, you are implying that there is a standard of beauty and perfection out there that certain people come closer to than others. So either way, you cannot complain about justice, cheating, individual bad people, unless there is some overarching rules that are being broken or standard. So what might that standard be? So let's move up a notch. What about evolutionary outcome? Could morality be just the outcome of our evolutionary history. As many I've often heard raised, okay, it's evolution did it. Evolution did it is kind of like one of the great God of the gaps of our secular culture. Don't know what happened, how to explain this, evolution did it. But here's a problem. If morality is in our genes, you shouldn't have to teach it to anybody. I don't have to teach my kids how to breathe, how to grow hair. I don't have to teach my kids how to have a leg, how to digest their food. That's all in their genes. It all comes natural. Now, granted, there could be like a genetic disability where some medical care needs to be given, but in general. So having had 6 kids, I can tell you that lying, fighting, and theft come naturally. So if we're going to look at morality as an outcome of our genetic history, you just watch little kids and how they naturally live, and you soon see that it can become like animals. Animals are always fighting each other. Yeah, Alexis.
What do you mean by morality? Because like when we read C.S. Lewis, he's talking about how everyone has a sense of right and wrong. Yeah. That's inside of us.
Yeah.
But is this kind of saying like we don't really have that? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm using it in a very vague sense at the beginning here, and eventually it gets sharper and sharper as the standard gets more well-defined. But morality is rules, some sort of sense of good and justice, goodness and justice, a sense of that. Romans tells us everybody has that within them. There might be some psychopaths, for example, where that's an issue.
Is goodness and justice different than right and wrong?
It'd be right and wrong. You see, I used goodness because I wanted a positive standard. I did not say right and wrong, but a positive standard automatically entails that if it doesn't conform to that standard, it's wrong. So right and wrong would be part of that standard of goodness. But I'd like to go higher than that. I'd like to ultimately go perfection and beauty, and the reason I say that is that I think people often need to have their minds broadened as to what the standard might be like. It's not just rules. It's something better than rules. And we're going to get to God in a minute. I almost never agree with Richard Dawkins, but I do agree with him on this. I don't actually have the quote here, I don't think. Let me take a peek. No, I don't have the quote here. But he says, we don't look to your genes to teach us morality, to teach your children morality. You're going to have to teach them. It's something that's taught from generation to generation, morality, or what's right and what's wrong, what's just and what's not just. That's going to have to be taught. So evolution is of no help in whether something is right or wrong or just or good. It's more like, for example, if we put a new cow into our herd back home, you immediately have all sorts of pushing and shoving break out and fights while they reestablish their pecking order. So even cows have a pecking order, even cattle have a pecking order. And that was established by shoving each other around at the feeding, at the corrals where they stick their head through to eat hay in the wintertime. Yes, Alexis.
I don't know if I agree with that, because I feel like we are born with a sense of right and wrong.
Oh, we are. And I'm not saying we aren't. Romans says we are, which is true. We are born with a sense of right and wrong. Okay, so what I'm saying is this sense of right and wrong must not come from our genes, because our genes produce the kids that fight, steal, hit each other, and lie. Okay? So if we have to teach it, then there is a morality here somewhere, but it's not coming from it's not genetic, it's not physics and chemistry. It's something else about us that has this moral code. So atheists will say, I don't need God to be good, and I'll say, no, you don't, thanks to your God-given moral intuitions. And I stick God-given in there, and then we can have a chat about that. So, okay, we need to move up another level then. If it's not evolution, if it's not individuals, could it be society that does this? And it is true that society can make up its own rules. It is true. For example, there is a moral theory or theory of ethics called contractarianism, where we have an unwritten social contract whereby we can all get along together. It's not, oftentimes it's codified in the form of laws, So that unwritten social contract will sometimes be, the government will make a set of laws on the basis of what they observe, what we all need to get along together at.
So kind of like saying, having it ingrained that you teach your kids to please and thank you and you're welcome and like niceties because that's part of the culture.
Yeah, part of the culture, get along, you know. What do I don't do in my culture back in Canada? What are the things I don't do? It's kind of hard to think of what you don't do because you're so programmed to not do those
things.
things.
You don't sneeze all over another person. You don't
That's right.
yell at somebody. Like those things are going to create conflict or distaste.
Exactly. Here's an example. There's a YouTuber named Humor Bagel, and his thing, there's a couple of them, their career is actually farting in public, but not real farts, but the man-made ones. But the interesting thing is the reaction of the people. You can tell, oh, this is a violation of the social contract going on here. Like when he lets one loud honker go.
Japanese if you do it in Japan, ooh.
What?
I don't even know what would happen in Japan. You just don't do it.
Oh, of course not. You don't do it anywhere. Yeah.
Nothing, like you just hold it in. I'm like, how?
But the reaction of the people's faces tell us that this is a violation of the social contract. So I will concede that there's contractarianism going on. There's also utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is another moral theory, and it's a set of rules that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. So communist regimes tend to go more with the utilitarian approach, not with America goes with the contractarian approach in Canada. In fact, one of our prime ministers always would say, it's what Canadians want when he was drafting a new law. This is what they would do their surveys. What's the unwritten consensus here? Then they would do a law on that. Some of them are definitely not what Canadians want. Our gun control, for example, is most Canadians think gun control does nothing to stop crime, but yet our government is cranking her out in ever more stringent ways. That would be an example of contractarianism, but then it moves into other things like our government in Canada. Problem, we believe that some societies are better or more just than others. That's the problem. Well, how can you say that? If each society makes up their own rules and we say that's where the rules come from, it's kind of like we're back to the same situation again. That's that society's truth. This society's truth over here is different. And how could we have the audacity to say this society, let's say America, is more just and a better place to live than, say, North Korea? How could you say that? And so most people would agree that certain societies are better than others. And even if they would, by some stroke of insanity, think that North Korea is as good as America, because I've been to both. Obviously, I've been to America. I'm here right now, but I've been to North Korea a couple of times as well. Even if they said it was the case, most people would never argue that this society here, they would look at a previous society. Let's say Roman society and the Colosseums where they'd toss people into the thing and they'd watch the lions rip them to shreds and stuff. Now, I know that people like to look at YouTube or, I don't know, where you watch videos of people getting killed. I don't think that's healthy at all. It's not part of whatever is true and right and good. Let's dwell on these things. It's definitely not part of that. But the moment we say that some societies are better than others, then you are in fact measuring societies and civilizations now by an even higher standard that transcends societies and civilizations. You see, we're inexorably driven towards a higher and higher standard all the time. And I'm still in common ground here when I talk with, say, on a university situation where I'm talking with an atheist who doesn't believe there is a God. They would still believe that certain societies have better moral theories than other societies. And okay, better by what standard? So one particular atheist prof, I said, so what is this standard that has enough teeth in it to actually feel that we should, as civilization society, comply with it, but not so much teeth that we're implying the existence of God here? And that's she had never thought of that. But it's a good question, yes.
Is there a difference between seeking justice and a moral standard?
Slightly different. So the seeking justice is seeking that moral, when you want justice, usually it's said in the term that something happened over here and that was a violation of that moral standard, and so we want that justice to occur, so you're implying there's a moral. It's a difference. Seeking justice is different than, now you come closer, you'd say seeking a knowledge of justice is actually seeking that standard. So there you're coming closer. But seeking justice is saying, I want that there to comply with this moral standard out here, even if you don't talk about the moral standard. Everybody talks about justice and injustice and suffering and evil. Everybody talks about that, but very few talk about the standard that's being violated. And so whenever someone will say, I don't believe in God because this, certain thing, and I'll say, okay, so you've observed things that are, you and I would agree that what you talked about there was very unjust, if not evil. But my question is, what is it that makes it evil? And most often it'll be the no harm principle. It's wrong to cause harm. That's their view of the ultimate view. That's the most common secular answer to that question. So my response might be, and I think C.S. Lewis has a similar one in Mere Christianity. So you're on a transit bus, and there's a person who's just got on, an elderly person has just got on, and this guy over there, let's call him Henry. Hopefully there's no Henrys here. Henry, actually, as the elderly person laden with groceries coming down, sticks out his leg to trip the elderly person in the aisle, but the elderly person doesn't actually trip and continues on. So he intended to cause harm, but never did. As the elderly person proceeds down the aisle, there is a person who is, let's say, maybe even mentally challenged and just not always responsible for keeping track of where his legs are. And one leg is sticking in the aisle. And no intent whatsoever. In fact, this person is a very gentle person. And it would be moved to tears if he ever harmed somebody or even saw somebody hurt. So he's got his leg sticking out the aisle. The elderly person comes and actually trips over his leg. Head first, knocks his teeth on the metal bit on the edge of the seat there, knocks out several of the front teeth. Terrible pain, writhing in the aisle. So the second person never intended to harm anyone, but actually did. Question, which person is more evil? The one who actually harmed somebody but not intended to, or the person intended to harm but never actually harmed anyone? Alexis goes with the first person, and I would agree, Alexis, that person is more evil. So that's a scenario you can put forward if the no harm principle is to be held up. And that is, well, there's more than harm here. There seems to be intent. And in fact, even secular law, often intent is a very important. And so in Canada, to be convicted, you have to show that harm was done and you intended to do that. Not just murder, but let's say any other way people are harmed. You intended to do it. So intent, mens rea, is the Latin form. So that's
the difference between manslaughter and murder, is it not?
first degree, and I'm not all up to date on the different degrees, but I know first degree requires intent. I don't know about second degree. And then there's manslaughter, just careless. You carelessly killed somebody because you were speeding or something. Didn't mean to kill anybody, but you did. But so we can't. So this no harm principle doesn't seem to work. And the other example, a problem with the no harm principle is, what if, like one of my vivid memories, I was probably around 2.5, and I don't have a whole lot of memories from 2.5. Basically only 2, no 3. 3 memories from when I was 2.5. And that's corroborated by my mother, otherwise I wouldn't know how old I was when the events occurred. But this one event, Mom said, we're going to see the doctor and he's going to give you a needle. No, I knew what a needle was when I was 2.5. And I gathered from that he's going to stick it in me. I had no idea why. So, and the reason I remember is the traumatic experience it turned out to be. So, I remember sitting in that little cubicle, and I don't know if it was a doctor or a nurse, but they pulled out this needle. And it was pretty clear to me as they advanced towards me that they're going to stick it in me. And I fought for my life. They actually had to call in another medical person to hold me down while they gave me this needle, and I had no idea. And my mom was helping them. I was betrayed. And I had no idea what was going on. And I walked out of there, and that was a traumatic, from then on, for many years. In fact, even in my old age, I fear going to see the doctor. That's why the last physical I had was only because the doctor insisted on it, and it had been 30 years since the previous one. And that last physical now is about, I don't know, about 6 years ago. I just hate going to the doctor. Psychologically irrational, I admit that. But it was actually for a good purpose. I think it was probably for polio or one other heinous disease back when I was a kid. We didn't have vaccines for measles, red measles, German measles, mumps, all that kind of stuff. Everybody just got that. And so we developed natural immunity against all those diseases. And I've never been vaccinated for those things because fortunately natural immunity for measles and mumps pretty much lasts your life. And chicken pox, yeah, all those bad ones. But there were two that we would get vaccinations. One was polio and the other was, smallpox. That was it. Not chicken pox, but smallpox. Those were the two. So it's probably a smallpox. I had no idea why I'm getting this needle and why they're doing this and my mom's helping them and everything else. So there's an instance of great harm as perceived by a little kid, great harm, but for a greater good or the avoidance of a greater evil down the road. So now we see that good and evil and justice and injustice are getting a little more complex now. It's not just simply don't harm people. What if it's good to harm? What if you're morally obligated to harm someone to avoid a greater evil? For example, here's a scenario that actually happened in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Man ordered to stay away from his estranged wife. He does it on Portage Avenue, is the main street through Winnipeg. 3 or 4 lanes each direction, big boulevard in the middle. He somehow stopped her in the middle of the Portage Avenue with traffic going by either way, hauled her out of the car and he began stabbing her. And with every blow of that knife, her chances of survival greatly decreased. Question, you're standing 20 yards away, the knife is about to come down for another thrust. You have, let's say you're not a very good shot, so you have a rifle. You have a rifle. Should you shoot that man? Should you harm the stabber or not? I would say you're morally obligated because if you wait another second, the knife comes down yet again and that could be the fatal blow. So this is what police officers have to deal with. They have these moral things and they're trained. I have a friend, a police officer, if he's within an X number of feet, he's got a knife and he's coming towards me, legally I can shoot him because studies show that even if I did shoot him, he could still cross that distance and kill me before he actually drops. They have all these rules and stuff. In general, though, see, the point is here that sometimes you might have to harm one person in order to keep them from harming another person. So there again, it becomes more complex. So what is this moral law? What is this standard? Well, first of all, point number 1 is the moral laws are only useful to minds capable of moral deliberation. They're not useful to fence posts and rocks. Only moral laws, or only minds. So we're trying to figure out where did this moral law come from? So I would say if we have something that's only useful to minds, it may have actually it may originate with some sort of a mind as well. Like if you find a recipe for chocolate cake blowing on a piece of paper in the wind, you pick that up, where'd this come from? There's a good chance it comes from someone who has an appreciation for chocolate cake. So this is how we're trying to figure out where does this moral law come from. Since ultimate moral laws must be perfect, because if they're not, they'll say, oh, this codex here of laws, very good, except for this law number 22. The moment you say that, you're implying there's a higher law still that this one does not quite measure up to. So it has to be perfect at the end of the day. And we really have no choice if we're going to argue about different moral laws. And the best, most likely source from that, so it's got to be from a mind, but now it has to be perfect, so it has to come from a maximally excellent mind. That's a phrase that Alvin Plantinga, a famous Christian philosopher, coined. Maximal excellence is that degree of excellence beyond which it's not logically possible to be more excellent. So now we see, we haven't proved the existence of such a being, but we're seeing the artifacts of such a thing. We're seeing we have this phenomenon that we actually believe things are morally right and wrong. We actually believe there's justice, and we're exploring where does this come from? Can't come from the individual, can't come from societies, can't come from evolutionary past. It has to be from some mind that's even higher up and perfect. And only then, point number 3, do we have a standard of beauty and perfection that cannot be compared with anything else. It is the standard. So we don't say, well, let's compare this with that. We look at the standard. See, intuitively, we seem to have the ability to look at these standards and say, oh, there's a problem here. This is a standard such that if we were to look at it, we would not have a problem with it, except for one thing. We only see the short term. And so I had to get hauled into the doctor's office and get a needle. And in the short term, that was painful, but in the long term, it may have prevented a much greater evil. So this makes things even more complicated. So it has to be so good that when we look, we actually see it one day, no one will dispute this is the standard.
Is that not what discipline does?
Well, again, discipline, yeah. In fact, we'll come to that one later. I had my backside smoked so often, even my mom used to cry later on in life about how many. I had a bum that was tough, let's put it that way. And only the very minor infractions did I keep my pants on. Standard procedure in our house, drop your drawers and a leather belt and away you go. It was hilarious in retrospect. It wasn't hilarious at the time. There were most of the time I thought I was going to die because Mom had this policy. If you spank a kid and they're angry, you haven't gone long enough. You got to spank them until they just think they're going to die. Then you quit, and then they won't do it anymore. And I was naturally a mischievous kid, and I have to say spankings were the only thing that stopped me from being bad. When I started going to school, and the teacher would say, "You're bad. You got to go to the library and study." Oh, yes, sir. Yeah. Or in grade school, she would draw a little circle on the blackboard, which was not at the level of my nose. Draw a circle about down here and put your nose in the circle, and for the next 45 minutes, hold your nose there. Yeah, that was one of the tortures. They literally did torture at my school. Like one would be kneel down on your knees and raise your hands in the air, and for the next half hour, keep your hands up, and if you drop them, you get a whipping. That was my school. And it would usually be in front of hundreds of students in the main hallway where all the classrooms converge.
That didn't bother you?
I was mad. That bothered me. See, even as a kid, that seemed wrong. It was wrong. It was wrong today, and it was wrong even as a kid. Like, I had serious doubts about that teacher. That really special. The circle on the blackboard was nothing compared to one of Mom's spankings, but the humiliation. I did get a couple of spankings in school, strappings, but they didn't know how to give strappings. They weren't like my mom. They would, a few on each hand, like I set a stink bomb off in French class one day, and I got a few on each hand. That was nothing. I was just thankful. Wow, like I got off scot-free for saying this stink bomb. Another time I got spanking in front of it. You came up the whole class. The whole class is there. So you come up to the front to get your whipping, which was not really a whipping. This was spanking on the hand with this leather belt. And you would hold out this hand and you would get your number of thrashings on that one, hold it this one. And it's like 3 or 4, which was compared to Mom, nothing. But it was humiliating. That was the big punishment. It was just absolutely humiliating to get strapped in front of the whole class. So here's back to the point. God is everything that is good and perfect. He is that standard. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, from whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And so ultimately, in an argument with a person who's talking about evil, I would say, I would just converse with them and say, my objective would be, by asking a series of questions, hopefully come to this point where I think we're talking about a flawless standard of perfection that's actually a mind that's out there that is standard of perfection and beauty, because even violations of beauty we have problems with. We're not talking about whether, I got brown eyebrows or red. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, let's say, a dead groundhog. There's something about a dead groundhog on the road that's not beautiful anymore, but it was once, with the fur and running around.
Do you have groundhogs in Canada?
Lots.
Okay.
Yeah, lots. They're a
I've
problem.
never seen one, so.
Oh, really? Woodchucks? Woodchucks? How about woodchucks? You got marmots. They're a very close relation to the marmot.
Deer would be pigs, at home it would be deer.
Okay, well, we'll move on. Forget the groundhogs then. They look like marmots if you're used to hiking in the mountains. Takeaway for part one, we cannot escape the need for a perfectly good God. If we are to talk meaningfully, and that's the key word there, meaningfully about evil and injustice, every violation of justice and perfection points to an ultimate standard that's being violated. One atheist I debated, Dr. DiCarlo, I wanted to prepare, so I wanted to see what he has to say. And the question was, can we be good without God? And in his writings, he said the number one problem for atheism is to find grounds for morality. He says we can be good, but what is it that makes us good? What are the grounds for thinking we're good? And you say, look, it's nonsense to talk about justice and goodness if there is no standard to measure. It's nonsense to talk about something being straight unless there is a concept, like some sort of a ruler or straight edge, that we can compare it to. C.S. Lewis makes that point. Okay, why we have no idea, part two, why we have no idea what God should or should not allow. And so the idea here in that little GIF is that is a single event right there. Hold it. Right there. That's a single event, but that one event ripples outwards through time. And that's huge for why we do not know what God should and should not permit, because we typically see the event and maybe a couple of immediate consequences, but we have no idea how this will ripple outwards for future history over the next thousands of years. No idea at all. So let's move into, dive a little deeper into that one. Let me give you an example in real history. I'm fascinated by this. So Sir Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of England during the Battle of Britain. And he made decisions that immediately affected the lives of millions of people and indirectly have affected the life of every person alive today. So that's just some history on him. Now, with that piece of backstory, if on the night that Winston was conceived, Lady Randolph Churchill had fallen asleep in a slightly different position, then the sheer millions of genetic combinations that are possible at any conception, coupled with that slightly different position, would have virtually guaranteed that a different Churchill would have been conceived and born, changing the course of World War II, because that person would not have existed, not made the decisions, not been Prime Minister, changing the course of World War II and the way the world is today. So the idea...
Scientific fact?
Oh, yeah.
Because you have a bunch of eggs, and then eggs are in a different position, and they interact differently, and then it's all...
Usually there's one egg, but there's millions of sperm. Millions. And so it's first to the finish line is the killer, and there's millions. And so any change, subtle changes in the internal organs will change the race course, so to speak. And it'll be a different genetic combination at conception. And usually it's only one sperm that does the job, because you don't want two. There's serious genetic problems if you do. So basically, the position that a woman falls asleep in at night, we could say, was that morally right or wrong? And you would say, what are you talking about? It's not a moral decision how I'm sleeping at night. And it's all different positions throughout the night. So that's thought to have no moral significance at all. But you can't just look at that one event. You have to look at, well, what happens as a result? And decades later, decades after Winston was conceived, the Battle of Britain occurred. Decades. And he had made decisions that had huge moral consequences. So if you're going to argue about whether or not the position that a woman falls asleep in at night is morally right or wrong, or should God allow that? We're not talking about moral rightness and wrongness here, because there's another factor that comes to play. But what we're talking about is whether God should have allowed Lady Winston Churchill to fall asleep in that position. We have to look at all the consequences at the end of human history, and what person is there capable of doing that? So, bottom line is that every event, no matter how small, right there, that's the first event, produces an exponentially increasing number of consequences into the future. Each one of you are initiating consequences in your own causal chain of events that in fact, you are initiating, every time you make a decision and do something, you're initiating another causal chain of events that not only may affect you, it'll affect your surroundings, it'll affect other people. and it may affect their decisions that they make. And so eventually, this whole situation here, the consequences just spread. Now, this is time, and this could be taken as geography, for example. One event, consequences begin to multiply and spread throughout future history until all of human civilization is affected. So the mere fact that Alexis is swinging her thing there has changed the course of human history. And I'm not joking. How? Yes, how? So, okay, first of all, what happened is that I noticed that. So that changed even what I said. But then I brought it to the attention of the class. And now you're thinking about her, and the things that you would have been thinking of are now different. You're now thinking of different things. And you will remember this in days to come. But you know, it's not just this. It's every single decision we make. Everything we do changes the future. It's an enormous response. That's why I think it's best to be totally surrendered to God on a daily basis, guided by the Holy Spirit, so that we know we're heading in the right direction, so to speak. So we need to know what gratuitous or unjustified evil is. This is heavily used in philosophy. It's basically evil that not produce a greater good or prevent a greater evil. That's what gratuitous evil is. And so the general assumption that atheists make when they say there is no God, because look at all the garbage here, the general assumption is that a perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing God would never permit gratuitous evil. Pointless evil is another way you could describe it. Pointless. It didn't bring about a greater good, didn't prevent a greater evil, so it's just pointless. Everything, or at least it didn't, there's a more technical way of wording this. But all you need to know is what gratuitous evil is. So what is gratuitous suffering? It's suffering that does not bring about a greater good or prevent a greater evil. Therefore, there was no justification for it. In other words, there has to be justification. If God is perfectly good, maximally good, all-knowing and all-powerful, then he would not permit things that were unjustified, that he could not justify in allowing, that were not justified according to his thing. So clarification, to know if an event is gratuitous, you'll note by the definition, it's not good enough just to know the moral value of that particular event. You also have to know what the consequences are and the moral values of those consequences. For both, not just for allowing the event, but what would happen if you didn't allow the event? In what way would the world right now be different if Alexis had never swung that thing? Or she had not, if Kate had not brought that gigantic water jug. And with those colors, she had not chosen those colors. It's just amazing. When you get into this, it's really interesting to start looking at history and how single, seemingly mundane event in the past, and you follow the chain of events. It's Battle of Little Round Top. There's something that happened there that just changed the course of the Civil War. Okay, the theist's argument from suffering. Proposition number 1, so far as we can see, there appears to be plenty of gratuitous evil in the world. I agree. Proposition number 2, if it appears to be gratuitous or unjustified, then it is unjustified. This is what's known as an inductive move. It doesn't logically follow that it's not justified, but inductive means it's probably, the evidence points to that it being unjustified. If it appears to be gratuitous, then it is unjustified. No, I might grant that if I didn't know very much about, say, the butterfly effect and what I just described to you. But once you become aware of the complexity of history, then that's the problem, proposition number 2. Just because something appears to be unjustified, like that needle I got when I was a little kid, I still got a scar from it, by the way, it's right there. Because smallpox needles did give scars on your arm back in the day. Logically follows that God would not permit unjustified evil, therefore God does not exist. And it all stands on proposition number 2, but I've just showed you why proposition number 2. But in general, here's what you need to do. E represents an event where you break your leg, and let's let the moral value of any event take values between -10 and +10. You just broken your leg. So the moral value of E, let's say it was -5, breaking your leg. Getting torture for 20 years straight and dying of the death of 1,000 cups, that'd be something like -9 or -10. So breaking your leg is -5. And then there's consequences. I got to wear this cast, -2. Oh, but then lots of people come to visit me. That's a +4. But then I can't walk very well. That's a -1 for a while. But then +4, something else, like somebody does my job for me that I was supposed to do, like vacuuming or something. So plus millions of other values of unknown sign, both negative and positive. That's reality, folks. That's the reality of any event. Whether it's a big water jug, whether it's waving something around, whether it's the shirt I chose to wear this morning, all of these things spew off events. So the moral value of F is now, what if we didn't allow that to happen? What if you never broke your leg? Well, obviously, those things happen never happen, but other things would happen instead. Well, first of all, because I didn't break my leg, I was able to go surfing this morning. I got +8 on there. That's a little much for going surfing. I'd give it +3. +8 is like I win the lottery or something, although that can have bad consequences. And before you can know if something's gratuitous, you got to compare the two possible worlds, the two possible histories. And because maybe something is really bad, like getting a needle, but if it prevents a greater evil, then actually that alternative of history would be even worse. And therefore, when you take E minus F, the net value is positive. So my mother was justified in giving me a needle and helping out the doctor. That's the imaginary example. But reality is way worse, because it's not just one event we're dealing with. It's not just the color of this water jug here that we got to concern ourselves with. How is now future history different because she chose that gradient of color? No, there's other events happening all over the world, billions of them. And the consequences are all merging and interacting. And so everything is changing. And so if you're God and you got to figure out what's got to happen or not, this event is not just merely its own consequences, but how those consequences influence the consequences of other events, of billions of other events. So if you've ever studied math or physics, you know that the number of unknowns, if you have two unknowns, you're going to need to solve for two equations for two unknowns and so forth. But what if you have billions of equations, each containing millions of variables? These are not unknown variables. Well, what you now want to do is when you tweak the variables, you come to a maximum peak in goodness. This is where calculus comes in. So you want to know so you got to solve billions of equations for millions of variables, tweak those variables, millions of them all the time, to figure out which is the best of all possible worlds. What human is capable of that? None of us. Here's an example of deleting an event from history. So it would have had all these consequences, which would have influenced everything different, but that event was deleted, not allowed to occur. Let's say nuclear war let's say the Cuban Missile Crisis. God did not allow that event to occur. Well, now the whole world's different now. And so we just don't know bottom line, and we'll quit here. See God's response to Job. God doesn't tell Job, well, here's all the reasons I allowed this. No. He says, you know nothing. That's basically the bottom line. You have no capability to understand what I should be doing. So let's quit. Sorry for going over time. Let's make up for that by starting at 5 after, okay? 5 after we'll start.